Okay. So I'll start with some background motivation. What's SLR? That's the Systematic Literature Review. And I'm kind of looking at Juraj because he's probably the one who can use this. So why we want to do this? Maybe put this into context, because I did this just this fall. Okay, this is not something that I've done many times. It's just the first time I tried it. I wanted to see how it works. Talk a little bit about what I call protocol, which is subject to change, but the protocol, I mean things that students were expected to do, that I was expected to do, and how that whole thing is supposed to, what's the result in the end. And you'll see why protocol, the label is used. So I'll share with you some initial results. This is very recent, like I had to give out grades maybe 10 days ago, a week ago. So that was part of the grade for a course. They had to do this. And then I'll make some conclusions at the end. So Juraj, is it okay if I walk up and down here? So the reason that I was interested in this in the first place was I teach two one is senior, so it's 4th year and then a graduate level course. And another one is strictly a PhD and maybe master's level course. One of them is solid state electronics. That's the PhD, 500, 600 master's PhD level. And the other one is senior slash graduate level. And in those courses for graduate students, what I do is I ask them to write a research report. So, I tell them, okay, find something that interests you, and then come back with a report. And it never really worked the way I liked it, because I think students needed much more guidance than that. That was one thing. The other one is some students just don't have interest in anything, so you have to kind of, push them to find to do a proper job. And I didn't think that was really all that useful. They were presenting this, and there were all kinds of ad hoc methods. I wouldn't call them methods. It was basically, let's put in this problem that I think I have into Google, see what comes up, and then I'll find something that is interesting maybe to present later on. But that was one problem. The other problem was that it was hard for me to grade this stuff, because since it was vague, I couldn't really tell whether that lived up to my expectations or not. So this was both writing and assessment or grading of the resulting report were highly subjective. That was another reason I didn't particularly like this. So I was thinking, oh God, there's got to be a better way to do this. I just didn't know how to formulate this, and it sounded like it was a lot of work to do. So, and then, I started thinking about these review articles. And I'm absolutely positive that you've read many review articles. So how would you describe a review article? It's usually something that we'll call narrative review, which is usually somebody is asked by an editor of a journal, and they tell them, look, I need something on the latest in graphene research at, I don't know, terahertz frequencies, okay? And then that person, gets together, maybe with their students, and they write up a review, which is really an overview of current state of the art in a particular given area. And we're all familiar with this, but the really problem is, again, it's difficult to judge those reviews, whether they are good or bad. Once we read it, we can usually tell, this is a pretty good review, especially if that's our area. Then we can judge whether that's a good review or not. And that was another problem that I came across was, okay, so that review didn't seem very scientific. Because if you look at this, when people write the reviews, they don't tell you how they did it. So if somebody else was asked to write the same review, it would be probably, maybe not in a major way, but it would be different review than what that other person published. So the question is, how would you have some systematic way of doing this kind of reviews? And again, narrative reviews has its place. It's a great piece, it's an IEEE spectrum. They'll have, those review articles about state of the art of something. Those would fall under that heading. There are more specialized ones. But so there's nothing inherently wrong about the narrative review, but there is a different way to do it. And turns out, I came across this in an article published last summer where they talk about using systematic literature review in software engineering. I was like, what does that have to do with anything? You know, software engineering. Turns out what they do is in software engineering, they have many different ways of writing code. So they organize things in different ways, and then they publish how well did it work, okay? And then you say, okay, here are 5 studies that talked about this, and somebody then tries to put them all together and say, you know, here are the things that really work, and this is a good study, and that's not so good study, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, that's been going on for about 10 years now. There's some guys in the UK, Kitchenham is one of the professors that studied this in software engineering. So they define it as a systematic review as a means of evaluating and interpreting all available research relevant to particular research question, topic area, or phenomenon of interest. Systematic reviews aim to present a fair evaluation of a research topic by using trustworthy, rigorous, and auditable methodology. Now, there's a lot of words in there, and I'll show you another one. I think the key here is that in this definition, when you look at this as trustworthy, it's the quality of the data that gets in, you know, garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. It's got to be good stuff going in. It has to be rigorous in a sense that there has to be some way of reproducibility, or it has to be explicit so that you know what they did when they studied this. And auditable, in other words, you can go through the same procedure yourself. You know, it's not subjective judgment by somebody. Well, it turns out these guys weren't the first one by a long shot to try this. This is actually fairly standard procedure in, guess what? In medicine. They actually have gone out of their way to define what a systematic literature review is in a sort of semi-official way, so that many journals actually, if you're going to write a systematic literature review, require that you follow this PRISMA statement, which is the statement of how these kinds of reviews should be done. So this is clearly a review of a clearly formulated question that uses systematic and explicit methods to, you know, sounds very much like the other one, to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant research, and to collect and analyze data from the studies that are included in the review. And then, a lot of times, what medical people will do is do a meta-analysis. So they'll pull all the data from different studies and then present that as an additional component. It's not necessary for a systematic review, but it is, you know, if you want your paper to be cited, that's really a way to do it. You know, use the meta-analysis. So you use that to analyze and summarize the results. And again, this PRISMA statement, unfortunately, it's very long. I'll show you an example of what that is. But here's just a comparison between the narrative, you know, which is what we normally see in journals that we read, and systematic review. And I tried to find systematic reviews, and very few, if any, outside of that software engineering area. So look at the first one, investigate a clearly defined topic. The other one is intended to provide an overview of an area, okay? So that's different. You know, in the first one, you say, this is the research question I have, okay, and I want to find out what I can about it and find gaps or some other things about it. The other one is not necessarily, may look for that, but may not. Literature is gathered using explicit search protocols. This is really important because nowadays there is just so much data that actually knowing what people are doing when they search for something is key. This one, protocol, is typically not used in narrative reviews. They will have a long section on citations of references at the end, but you will not know how they came across that, okay? So it is some element of subjective selection there. Studies selected using a protocol that specifies inclusion and exclusion criteria. typically that's not done in the narrative reviews. There may be some, but it's not explicit. And why is that important, especially in medical area? You know, you could come up to completely different conclusions if you exclude certain studies, right? So you just say, well, you know, that was, you know, obviously doesn't produce the result that I want, and therefore you just eliminate it. And there are other things. There's things they talk about, publication bias, all kinds of other stuff that can happen. But here in a systematic literature review, you're supposed to say, I searched for this using these keywords, you know, and sometimes they'll spell it out completely. I'll show you. But I eliminated certain studies because da-da-da-da-da. And then you can give your reasons why you decided to eliminate them. If you don't have, you know, if you find that study doesn't fit what you thought you were looking for, you got to go back and change the search criteria. Okay. It may be synthesized in meta-analysis. Typically, that's not done in narrative reviews, but it may use some evidence rating system. And basically, selection is a rating system of sorts. And then when evidence is lacking, the authors usually recommend further research, and then the other one is recommend something based on their opinion and experience. That's very similar. So this gives you some idea of what to expect when you do systematic versus narrative. Now this, going back to that PRISMA statement, which is what medical community uses, and it's about 2009. It's relatively new. There was one preceding it, probably about another 10, 15 years prior. It has 27 items. It's a checklist. So you go down the list and check, 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 and your study has to conform to most of these, if not all of these, 27 things. So for example, the 7 areas that they have to have, it's title, abstract, obvious, introduction, methods, results, discussion, funding at the end. So for example, a requirement is that present full electronic search strategy for at least one database, including any limits used such that it could be repeated. This is really important because if you're going to try to reproduce somebody's results, without it, you're lost. You don't know how they searched and what database they used. State the process for selecting studies. Again, this is key, especially for medical guys, because if you're excluding things, you could end up with different results. So that's where it's coming from, and this is actually one interesting thing. They explicitly talk about how the data is going to be processed. So it go identification, screening, eligibility, and is it included or not at the end. So this tells you, kind of step by step what the process for gathering data, which is papers, a number of records identified through database. So, we found 500. A number of records duplicates removed because you could get them from different databases. Then you screen them based on certain criteria. You decide, again, provide a number of those full text articles that are deemed to be eligible for inclusion. And then you say, okay, well, out of the 500 we found, in the end, we ended up with 100 that are included in this qualitative analysis. And if you have meta-analysis, that will be a quantitative last step. Okay? Now, that sounds actually like a lot of work. And actually, systematic literature reviews are a research area of its own, especially in medical area, because there it's really important. Nobody can really follow everything that's published in medicine. I mean, we can't. I mean, I can't. I got a stack of papers to read about that big. So those are very important because, for example, practitioners, doctors who are working with patients want to know, does this stuff work and what's the best procedure to apply when I'm dealing with patients, okay? So the systematic literature review is supposed to provide you that kind of a guidance so that you can then apply what the best research, current research is, okay? So, but for us, it's really, for example, if you're doing the PhD dissertation proposal, that would be a typical place where you're asked to do a literature review. I had a student, maybe a year and a half ago, he didn't follow this because I didn't know about this. Now I'm going to ask all the students to follow this as a protocol. The reason is there's just no way that I could find out if he missed anything. I just read his thing. Yeah, okay, this looks about right. Okay. I mean, who's going to read 300 something references, you know. So you need to have a way in there to justify, you know, this is legitimate, so to speak. Starting a new research area. This is interesting for me, and you'll see from the example that's how I started this. You want to know whether something has been done already. And for that, you have to go through this process. And what does happen, and people in more on the social science side of things, education, for example, especially, once they do this, they find out gaps. And they say, look at this. You know, nobody's actually covered this area. Let's explore that some more. So this is a sort of meta research. It has a research about research. You can also use this to summarize your own research area. And one thing that you may get out of this so far is that it assumes that you have a certain level of expertise to do this, right? I mean, you don't typically expect undergraduates or even doctoral candidates to be able to just go and do this. But that's why I was so interested to read that paper where they talk about software reviews, software engineering reviews, because they actually did it with undergraduate students. And they used that as a teaching tool so that they can actually then teach them not just how to do the method, systematic literature review, but that they also learn something about software engineering. Okay? And to me, that's much more powerful than the previous stuff. Previous stuff, you know, we can kind of guess. You know, that's what the exercise we did at the beginning. You know, that's kind of what goes into that. It's just more systematic. But this is applying that not just in the research context, but in education. Okay? And in this, there is an assumption, you know, that only experts can do this. And I want to challenge that. And I want to actually try to explain that you can do this with undergraduates and graduate students, perhaps. So my thoughts on this were, okay, so that SLR can be taught, so that students can actually learn how to do this. Again, you need structure. It's much harder to do this in just, here's the topic, give me something back, okay? I'm exaggerating, but that's how it goes. But, you know, I want to emphasize SLR as a general method of inquiry. So, again, if you're writing a dissertation proposal, you're trying to find out what is new and different about what you want to do. So it's inquiry. It can be useful, another hypothesis, it can be a useful learning tool in a given subject area. So you'll see I applied this in the solid state materials, physics, really. But, you know, I'm going to try to use this in circuits, in microwave circuits next. But so that's emphasizing using a specific area. Students learn in best in a specific context. That's my hypothesis. I don't have a particular proof of it, but I think most people would agree with that. My analogy with that is technical writing. A lot of places have technical writing as a course. So students, we do. So students learn how to write in a technical writing course. Problem is, we get them as seniors and they can't write. I don't know if that's your experience. But what is the problem? The problem is that they learn that in one course, and that's it. They never get to see or apply that again. They don't make a connection that this is needed for some other course. Okay? So, but if it is repeated across the curriculum in different places, then it works. And of course, proficiency. You got to apply this many times before you are proficient in it. So the background here is this is that graduate course I was telling you about. This would be master's and PhD level students. Just did this last term. It is mostly about material properties. There are two projects. One of them is time domain spectroscopy in terahertz area, but they have to do some simulations and stuff. And then I got interested in thin films. That's because I was doing something with Tomislav Suliga, you know, on his pure B stuff, that I think is, you know, some metallic interface. So that's how I started looking at the what's being done in that area. Okay, trying to figure out. And I added that to students. I said, look, okay, here's what I'm going to expect you to do the systematic literature review of thin metal films which are characterized with terahertz signals, TDS, time domain spectroscopy. And my hope was that they would actually use that and then learn how to do this systematic literature review, but also that will help them understand thin metal films because they'll be reading all those articles about it, okay? And have to synthesize the stuff at the end. And what this article in IEEE Transactions on Education talks about is iterative SLR. In other words, we know when we do our search that it's iterative procedure because usually you find out, you know, I included too many keywords or too specific and I ended up with 2 papers, or more likely is you have it too broad and then you end up with, you know, 2,000 papers and you don't know what to do with it. Well, you're going to narrow down the search. So you have to change the question, right? I mean, that's how it goes. Okay, that's okay. So we do several iterations, and this is what this guy talks about here. So you start with planning and training. That's the first stage that we had up there. We didn't, actually. We started with definition. Question formulation, that's the second one. See, search strategy, we also had that up there. Selection, that was in there. Strength of evidence, actually, that is, before you get into analysis, usually you need to decide whether a particular paper is good enough to be included. So for example, students came across a paper, they said, you know, it looked great based on the title and the abstract. When we actually looked at the paper, it was a piece of crap. I mean, there was no data that was useful. They didn't say how they did it. You know, it was just poorly written paper. And therefore, it is legitimate to say, I'm not going to include that stuff, just not good enough, okay? Then comes the analysis. You look at all those papers, you read them, you analyze what's going on, and you start formulating how you're going to organize this. I told students, look, think of this as what's your table of contents going to look like? How are you going to, you have 50, most of them had 25 to 30 papers. They usually worked in groups of 2 or 3. So it's about 15 papers to read. How are you going to organize all those papers? I don't want you to go paper by paper by paper and say this paper this paper this. No, you have to, okay, I have a bunch of papers that talk about terahertz and gold. I have a bunch of papers that talk about silver, etc. So maybe you can organize it by material. Maybe you can organize it by temperature or some other organizing principle. But eventually, you have to write a critical appraisal of all that stuff. That's the synthesis. And process monitoring, that's actually the job of the instructor. You have to follow them and find out what they're doing or not, and whether it's any good. So what I've done is I adopted some stuff from different places, but you know, I have kind of 10-week protocol, give or take about a week, actually more like 9 weeks, where students are asked to do certain things every week. To be honest, they didn't do as expected. I think it's mainly because there was no grade associated with it. But there is such a list, if you will. I had them in groups of 2 or 3. We had about a weekly examination of their progress. That's that process monitoring part. I wanted to know where they are. They couldn't quite, you know, avoid this. Now, key here was we have a very good librarian in our technical area. He gave a lecture on how to do search, which databases to use, how to set up your keywords, you know, what to do when something happens. And he's good because he does this on a regular basis. He goes to different, you know, departments and gives the same kind of lecture. Now, one thing that I don't know how novel it is, but do you guys know about the Zotero? It is a free, you're shaking, you know about it? Okay. So it is a free software that you can use to organize your citations or references. And what I used actually I can set up groups so that students can work together, and when they find papers that they are looking at, they can, for example, put them in different directories and say, okay, well, here's what I want to keep, here's what I'm eliminating, or for that reason, and here's another ones that I'm eliminating for another reason. What's the name of it? Zotero, Z-O-T-E-R, Zotero, over there. And it turned, that part actually worked out very well. It's free, and the other useful feature is if you get onto a site that it recognizes, then all you have to do is just click on an icon in, it works best with Firefox, but I use it with Chrome and some other things. And it just, you click and it puts the entire citation and usually the paper into your database. And you can do all kinds of machinations. The best part is, you know, when it generates the bibliography for you. You know, you can specify IEEE format and it just spits it out. How's that working for you, Jure? Zotero? Yeah. It's great. Yeah, what is that? It saves a lot of time. Saves a lot of time. Review? References, yeah. So it is a, actually I just started using it. I was delaying for a long time, and then 5 months ago, for this reason, I started using it. And the other one is Mendeley that people use. It's also free, but the limitation was they only allow 3 people in a group for free. Zotero doesn't have that limitation, and I needed 4. So, So I did a little bit of a pre and post survey from students to find out how familiar they are, what they know about it, how they do it. And the striking thing was, you know, these are supposedly guys who have done some master's level stuff already, second year usually of master's level or PhD program. Or certainly some of them should go into PhD. With one exception, they've done absolutely no literature review prior to this class, okay? And after I talked to my colleagues and I said, hey, you know, what do you think of your students' ability to do this kind of review? They all said they can't do it. But when I asked them, do you teach them how to do this? Nobody does. So the usual answer to this problem is, oh, we'll set up a seminar or we'll set up a course that will teach them how to do literature review. Not necessarily systematic literature review, but a literature review. So to me, that was not a good answer. To me, the right answer is this has to be in different courses so that when they take those courses in first time, the second time, the third time, well, the third time they'll learn it actually. If they do it as part of a seminar, you know what happens? They do it, they forget about it, and that's it. You know, unless they really repeat this stuff, I don't think it really works. And I actually heard students say that they're scared of doing this. These guys, some of them very good students, and they said, we've never done this, I don't know how to do it. How am I going to do a review of an area that I'm not familiar with, that I don't know anything about? That was the first reaction, okay? Which is understandable, right? I mean, but on the other hand, we know when we find that problem or run into that problem, well, okay, I don't know that, but I'm sure I can figure it out. See, and students have to learn that that's something that you can actually learn. So as the quarter progressed, students got, you know, more comfortable, you know, not quite, they weren't following my protocol, by the way, but about 2 weeks late. But that was, at the end of that term survey, I had the same questions that I asked, again, how confident you are, for example, that you can do the literature review, systematic literature review. And it also tried to identify some barriers to, or how effective this was. And, you know, not surprising, there was an improvement in familiarity with the process, because that's what I taught them. That would be, you know, really bad if they didn't think that it was improved. And their confidence was increased. But this is interesting, their perceived usefulness declined. This is a small sample, okay? I got 6 out of 7, you know, who replied. The total was 7. So this is a graduate level course. You know, this is not 70, this is just 7. But my next iteration is going to be, I think, a little bit larger. So we'll, you know, make this statistically significant. But the reason I think that this happened is many of these students work. So initially, they thought this would be very useful for their work. Turned out, after they've done it, turned out, well, you know, maybe this is a little bit too much work, you know, to be really useful at work. because they do it. That, again, this is a perception. But they all loved Zotero. They all liked using Zotero, and there was no really negative reactions to that. I also asked them, what did you find most time consuming? They found, you remember when we were talking about this, selection and analysis, which is to be expected. That was time consuming because you had to read all of the articles, before you can proceed. And you find out. Now, there are some tricks. There is preliminary elimination, for example, that happens just by judging by title and abstract. But if you got 70, 80 articles, it takes a lot of time, okay? And then you may have to go back because you discovered, oh, well, I have to include something else and da-da-da, all right? What was most challenging and confusing is question formulation and analysis. The second analysis was kind of widely distributed, but the question formulation came out as the most challenging component. Again, because these are novices, they don't know the area. They struggle with how to formulate the question. Even though, it doesn't sound like it's a big deal, because I gave them almost everything, in that. This is my daughter, sorry. Gotta turn this off a little. So that's not terribly surprising that they had, fear and a hesitation about the question formulation. Now, what they liked the best, what was best explained in class was the business with search. And guess what? That was done by the librarian, not by me, okay? So this points to the importance of having somebody who knows their stuff, because students found that to be really useful because they had to go into databases, do the searches, where do you put the star, for where do you put, some other characters, etc. What was the worst explained, because I didn't do anything, was the synthesis. And the problem with synthesis is it really relies on their writing skills. On the one hand, they have to have critical thinking. They have to be able to pull all this together. But really, if they don't have the writing skills to do it, it's not going to happen. So synthesis turns out to be a biggest barrier. So I'll try to do some exercises next time to help with the selection analysis and synthesis. Maybe provide some good and bad papers. Try some scanning. We didn't do many exercises. This is the first time I ran the class with this. So I didn't have much material. But next time I'll try to do, they needed more training. I think that's the answer, okay? Writing, I don't know what to do about, okay? Because I get them at the PhD level. If they can't write at that stage, I mean, things are pretty hopeless. So I don't know. There is, I think, I got the course evaluations also, and the biggest complaint is that it was too much work. This was add-on, they thought, that they didn't really need to do, even though I made it clear that it's integral part of the course and everything. But I can understand, I think semester is actually much better frame than a quarter. Quarter is just too short, if you haven't done it before. Next time they do it, 10 weeks will be enough. But the first time, 15 is probably better. That's my, estimate at this point. And part of the reason is I simply didn't have any Luft. There was, they just had to do this according to schedule. And as soon as that schedule slipped, there was no way to quickly recover. With 15 weeks, you have a little bit more time. And I'll reorganize the course actually to fit this project better, because I started with another project first. There's no reason that I can't start with this project right away. So that way they'll have the experimental part where they have to write some MATLAB and da-da-da, and start searching literature, writing and da-da-da. So it'll fit better. I was just too hung up on how I did it before. So, as I said, this was the first time. Many things were unknown. It was intentionally open-ended. Students needed more guidance, but I wanted to get their reaction. I wanted to see what mistakes they will make, okay? And if I give them all the guidance, then, it's not going to give me that. So it was maybe a little bit unfair to students, but hey, this is, PhD level, all right? So I think it was okay to be a little bit more stingy on providing guidance. But now that I know a few things that come out of these surveys and from reading their reports, I think I can make it better next time. In particular, the format of the report was left vague. I need to provide, I think, more direction. I also tried using rubrics. For those of you who don't know what rubrics are, I'll maybe talk to you later. But they're used to assess quality of more comprehensive kind of assignments, like reports or, in this case, systematic literature reviews. There is one out there, but it's written by social scientists. It doesn't quite fit the technical areas. So, if anybody's interested, we could work on that one to improve it for electrical engineering. I didn't do this analysis yet. This is all very fresh. My first reaction is even though the question wasn't that complicated, I told you what it was, terahertz, TDS, thin metal films. Find the literature out there on that and tell me what's in, what's out, what's missing, etc. My impression is they don't overlap 100%, but if it is 50% in terms of papers they found, I think that'll be actually a good result. I don't think it's going to be that much of an overlap. And how do they formulate their research questions? Because that's really based on their search criteria. Sometimes I would ask them, what's your search question? They would tell me one thing, and then I ask, what's your search criteria? And it'll be another thing. Well, like, how do you think that you can't search for this, and this is your question? The two have to be the same, right? Organization in similar ways, I don't know yet. So, as suggestions, I'll leave that at the end, if you guys have any questions or whatever. So this is one other, just before I get into conclusions, one other thing that I didn't go into is I didn't quite follow the protocol that's in that paper that I mentioned. The protocol relies on database searches. Because this is tied into a course, I thought, okay, they would be just too lost if I just tell them, go do the searches. So what I did, I gave each group a seed paper in that area. And there are two ways to do literature searches. One is through databases. The other one is you have a paper or papers, and then you do the snowballing, they call it in English. You can do forward and backward snowballing. So in other words, you look for the papers that a paper cites, and then you look for the papers that cited that paper. And it is usually a good idea to combine that with the literature search, the database search. So they each got a different seed paper. So I just wanted to see if they would end up with a similar, if not the same set of papers in the end. But the starting point wasn't the database, it was a paper that I gave them. And part of the reason is, they have to start reading early. If they just do the database searches until, the end of the term, it's not going to be good. So this is then a work in progress. I find them encouraging, even though students were very critical, by the way. So, I got some of the worst evaluations ever. But mainly because they didn't like that it was so much work. Okay? It's a lot of work. But we do have a framework to do this ISLR within courses. That's the important part. I need some tweaking, the length, the details, etc. But we have a basics of protocol, basics of rubrics. We have a software tool to do it, Zotero. Okay? ISLR is situated, in my case, in relevant context, and is part of an authentic problem. In other words, this is not a made-up problem. This is a research problem that's about 7 or 8 years old. Thin metal film is about that old. There's still papers coming out on that area, okay? Now, you may not be able to do that for undergraduates. You may have to do some other topic, but if you can find a topic that fits into the topic or area that you're discussing in class, I think that's the way to do it. Why? Because I think it has result in better learning of both the method itself and the topic. So the idea is not just the method, but it also has to help their understanding of whatever you're doing in class. admittedly, evidence is slim that this is working. I only have 7, students who took this class. But I'm working on, kind of developing the assessment that will lead, hopefully, to a more rigorous assessment of how successful this was. And hopefully we'll publish this sometime at a conference. I'm sure we will. I will.